Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 542nd episode of Constructed Criticism. I'm your host, Mason Jerome, my co-host, Abe Stein. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing today, Mason?
It's early in the morning. I'm a little tired. I played one too many games of League of Legends last night before going to bed, and it turned out to be one of those like crazy 45-minute games. And that was a compounding issue, if you know what I mean.
I'm not gonna lie. When we planned to record this episode at 9 a.m. My time, which is when for the listeners we're recording this right now, I like hit maybe like 11 o'clock, and I was like, "What if I just went to bed?" And then I was very sleepy and just passed out. I like finished up my league of Modern I was playing, and then like as soon as I had finished defeating my opponent, my eyes were just very heavy. It was over.
Nice. I was planning to like get off a little bit early, so I could go to sleep a little early. And like when I was starting to, I was just like, I'm not tired at all. And so it sort of
I mean,
compounded.
when the Nexus calls,
Yeah.
from what I've heard, the Nexus.
When the Rift pulls you in, it pulls you in.
Yeah, there you go. I didn't even know anything.
Yeah.
I don't play League.
That's
When the
right.
Rift calls, the Summoner's Rift. When the Rift calls, you answer.
You're like it's like the uncle at a family thing who's learning about something. It's like, yeah, the Rift calls.
Yeah, so tell me about these Pokemon cards you've been playing recently.
Oh my goodness. Speaking of cards and the worst transition we've ever done, we're going to be doing a episode today sort of about card evaluation. And this is a pretty unique and interesting episode, especially compared to what we normally do. This is sort of in the vein, of a training ground, something to take long term, but it's a bit more about preparing you before we even get into the game. And so I just wanted to give a little bit of a caveat about how, today's goal is sort of about card evaluation and how to identify sort of, as we call them in set reviews, hits. Sort of these cards are going to be high impact and are going to play a big role in formats. And this is a episode we want to do in two parts. One, because people kind of talk about and have asked us like how we go about figuring these things out. And two, because it legitimately can be very helpful when it comes to, one, early on in preview season, get an idea for cards and starting to think about things in this way. I think can really help listeners long term with deck selection. But also, while we think about this stuff a lot during the preview season, these sort of skills can translate to non-preview season times when you're trying to think about this new card I might be adding to my deck, or a card you haven't played a lot with. And normally you can shortcut maybe some out of what we're going to talk about today with a card that's been out by talking to a friend and someone who's maybe played this card before. But sometimes, especially if you're playing Aspiring Spike decks or, brewing a lot, you might be playing with cards that are not commonly played or haven't been played in a very long time. And so the context on them might be dramatically different. So we're hopeful that, today's goal will help you really at evaluating cards and kind of how to, look at something and try to get to its core. Because I don't know if you've ever been on social media during preview season. It's sort of a very wild time.
I mean, between getting all of that good engagement out of just posting like a picture of two cards together, and then also like kind of taking mental notes of like, so these people think this card is bad or good when I disagree. Like evaluating cards is something that there's so much to get right that we don't know, right? There's a whole context that isn't present when you're looking for the first time, that like it's just exciting, but also something that even like, I know I've been wrong about cards before. There's a whole like class of cards that look great on paper and just never really accomplish and achieve that even like members of play design don't know for sure what's going to happen. So it's one of the probably the most exciting part of preview season is getting to see other people's opinions and takes on the cards and just speculating on what it is we're all going to do in our lives. So yeah, it's definitely an experience.
Yeah, this is definitely like an art, not a science, right? And like you just said, we get stuff wrong all the time. I think one thing, like a good example about how much context matters for what it's worth, and like I think it's an important thing to mention early on here, but the context of the cards are in matter a lot. So you just mentioned like, sometimes a card looks really good on paper and just doesn't land. And sometimes, that card in any other standard format would be huge, But it turns out in our current one, we're playing this like 1 mana black Raven's Crime that shocks you, and we're playing it over and over again, right? And so this like 4 mana or 5 mana card that requires a little bit of setup that normally would just end the game on the spot is a lot less impactful. And I think a great example of this might be Glorybringer in a lot of standard formats. A card that's incredibly good in a ton of them, but might actually struggle in our current standard, despite there being things like Llanowar Elf, And I think even that statement is one that we could like go back and forth on. But it's a really interesting thing how much context matters. And I can give you an actual example of Felia, Exuberant Herder. We're seeing that card now become the kind of a mini staple of Modern. The black-white Taxes decks have picked it up and have started playing that card a lot. We're seeing some energy players, I believe, including the winning Moxilist, play the card, as a one or a two of. And it is sort of, making headways into being, this Modern staple. Well, it wasn't doing anything for the last 6 months. And when I worked on MH3, I kind of thought the dog was like a top 10 card. I was like, maybe outside looking in. Obviously, I'm not counting certain things like fetch lands that were in the set as an example. But like, I was like, yeah, this card's really good and like going to be underappreciated by players, I think, at first, but will turn out to be good. And, at first, when the card was being previewed, it kind of felt like what I had thought was going to happen was happening. People were like, oh, it doesn't seem so great, blah, blah, blah. And then you would start playing with it and, like, oh, you flickered a Construct, or oh, you flickered a Murktide, or you flickered a Psychic Frog. These things are all really strong. I flickered my own stuff. But that wasn't the world we lived in. The One Ring totally changed Modern in a way that, like, it was hard to really foresee, And another great example of cards being previewed and people getting it wrong is the One Ring. If that card was previewed for about 4 months before the set, or maybe even 5 months before the set came out, and nobody, in fact, I've only ever seen one gloating tweet about it, where it's like I saw one person tweet, I think this might be the best card in Magic, or, the best card in Modern when it comes out. And, they were right. But, I didn't think that. I don't think you thought that beforehand. Like most people didn't, because it's really hard and the context really matters on these things. And so this isn't a thing where it's like we're giving you some math lesson today, and at the end of it, you're going to be able to crunch the numbers and figure everything out. This is much more like art and in feel and interpretation. And hopefully the stuff we'll talk about, that how we go about it, will help you, and maybe something you haven't thought about before.
Yeah, I think that like most of all, like, I know this is a skill that, like, I kind of honed in playing a bunch of limited and, like, pre-releases back when that was, like, the most important thing that I would play in, like, a quarter, right? Before I was really playing competitively, and it was just, there was a big store pre-release, I wanted to do well in it, or, like, like, I'm reading the set as it's coming out, and what cards do I think are good? Like, what are the questions that you ask of a card, and how do you think about a card just absent of context, or try to create kind of a baseline context for cards and how to evaluate them. I think it's a really valuable skill to have, not only for like looking at previews, but also then when you're tuning decks or having ideas for like ways to build sideboard plans, right? Like the ability and the skills you get of how to evaluate cards in any context, the ways that you ask yourself, is this a good card? Or, does this card do, like, what does this card do? Those are good questions to have, a little bit more time and spend more time with those, because the more that you ask yourself good questions about the cards, the more you're going to wind up learning more about either why that's right or wrong. And the more you reflect on that, the more you're going to then be able to predict, or, maybe not even predict, but have a better estimate of what are the cards that are good, and make better, early deck choices, or, play the best cards in an archetype, or even know the cards that are able to go out of an archetype, right? It just helps you on paper understand what the important pieces are, and help you with establishing kind of a context for how to play them. Like, I know even this can happen in like sideboarding, right? Mm-hmm. When you're looking at your deck, something you've talked about a lot is one of your number one things you talk about in coaching, and is also brought to the show, is the question of like, what are your 3 best cards and 2 worst cards, right? Like, how do you know what those cards are if you're not really thinking about it, and just looking at cards and asking yourself questions like that of maybe not in the context of a matchup, but in terms of what they accomplish, which one of these are really better if they're vying for the same role, and why. And so I think it's really valid to get into that. So Mason, I'll let you lead the charge here. What are some of the things that you look at when you're looking at cards for either the first time or just trying to evaluate a card in the context of a format?
Yeah, so there are a couple things that I keep in mind. And the one thing that I sort of always keep in the back of my mind is a lesson I learned a long time ago from watching Brad Nelson on like a Kaladesh preview stream. And it was right when I was first starting to get really competitive about Magic. And this has always helped me a lot, where basically he's on stage and they ask Brad some question like, they had just announced vehicles. They were a brand new card type. And they go, Brad, do you think this will be good enough for competitive play? And Brad gives an answer that essentially boils down to, listen, I haven't had a ton of time to think about it. We all just saw it. But I'm going to try and think about what is good about these cards and, what could make them work, instead of telling you the why they can't work, and what could be wrong with them for sure. Because anyone can make a card sound bad, right? Like I can poke holes and point out strategies that cause your deck or your card to look awful. But figuring out how the card could be good or how to potentially use it to be strong, that is what makes or breaks people. So that's something that I keep in the back of my mind always, is like, I am trying my best to frame this in a positive light or a positive context, but notably realistic, right? I don't want to be thinking in Magical Christmas Landy type stuff all the time. I want to try to be thinking, realistically, what could I be doing with this card that is strong and powerful and something that like I maybe want to build my deck around, or is going to be a big helpful piece for my deck.
I mean, I definitely think of it in a similar vein. I think that it's important to know, what are the best things that a card can do, and what are the conditions under which a card is definitely going to be powerful, right? Like it's very easy to do that with a card like Shieldred, because Shieldred is just going to be good if your opponent is drawing a card, which they will do every turn, and if you're drawing a card, which you will do every turn, and if it's going to stay on the battlefield, right? Like that, everything about that card is set there to be, good. But it's very easy to say dies to Doomblade, or like even with the One Ring, I feel like I was guilty a bit of being like, well, it's a 4-mana sorcery speed card. How much is this card going to get spell pierced or counterspelled or force negationed, without really thinking about what it would take for a deck to play those kinds of answers in the context of modern format, and what happens when that card is backed up by those same protection spells, right? Like those are all things that I maybe didn't think about at the time, but became true over the life of the format, that or at a certain point, people don't just always have the answer, or you have the ability to play through soft counter magic, and at that point, the card will take over the game, right?
Yeah.
So I think I actually take it a bit further than that, where like I try to think about cards in terms of like of ceiling, like Brad's talking about there, of like how is this card good and where is it its best, maybe even thinking about entertaining the idea of a Magical Christmas Land situation, because I think it's important, especially with things like, I mean, you look at the success of Sanctum of All, and especially like CFT Sock and Jason together, but I think CFT Sock especially will take the time to think of like a Magical Christmas Land combo situation, and then start to work backward from there to see if it can actually be made realistic, right? I mean, that's how we wind up with Slogurk. That's how we wind up with, Temur Analyst, is that we take these cards that they look at the ceiling on them and the power level and say, okay, this is really, really strong. Can we actually make that happen? And they do. I think a lot of players miss that because it can be a big waste of time, because the way that we typically think about things is also at the floor, right? You think about the worst a card could be when the card has no backing material and is, just standing on its own at its mana value, what its impact to the game is and the board is, like those are can be two wildly different things, and kind of understanding the middle ground there for most cards, gets it right most of the time, right? Because you're not always going to have it at its best, you're not always going to have it at its worst. But if you, really, if you discard that some cards are going to be only played when they're at their best, or only at their floor in decks like mid-range decks, right? Like Tarmogoyf is great because it's way above rate, but these days is just a big body, right? But there is the ceiling is that it's bigger, and the floor is that it's smaller, but oftentimes it lands in the middle. It's a very easy card to evaluate once you can evaluate the stats of the format. Looking at something comparatively like, Slogurk, you have to have like 10 pieces around it, right? You have to have a bunch of legends and relic of legends, and the channel lands need to exist. And so it's about finding those contexts. But also like you said, finding the places where it's good, but the floor on Slogurk just being a 3-mana 3/3 legendary creature. I mean, the Slogurk Legends deck from that one RC in Canada, like that really started to put the Slogurk stuff in motion. I feel showed that at its floor of just being a legendary creature, that could be good enough in context because it had the upside too, right? It's about the range of outcomes a card can produce. And so I always start by just defining those ranges.
Yeah, I really like that, what you're talking about there. I think another thing I try and keep in mind, and this is a smaller thing to probably not to delve too deep on, but you kind of hit on it in there a little bit, and I just want to highlight it, is thinking about a card when played off curve. I think so often people are like, okay, I got this 3-drop, I play it on turn 3, or in like the case of the One Ring, I got this 4-drop, I play it on turn 4, right? And obviously, lots of times that's the best time to play your card is as soon as possible. But there are, other times where, I think I like the One Ring. The One Ring is a good example where, yeah, playing this on 4 is great, but also maybe I interact a little more and then I slam it on 5 or 6, and I like have counter magic up, or like, that ends up lining up really well against the permission or what you're trying to do. You're trying to kill me on turn 6 and I give myself protection. So I think that's like a really important thing too. It's just like, sort of like you just said, understanding the full ranges of the card. And that includes like, when you play it in the game.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also like, we're not coming up with these contexts of like, oh, is this going to be good at, right? All those things don't really mean anything without thinking about other cards. I don't know about you, Mason, but one of the number one things I will do, and I see other people do, is compare cards to other cards that exist already.
100%. I was going to bring this up. Talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the most natural thing to do. We see cards, and Wizards is not stupid. They know this about us. They try to trick us all the time into buying those same cards and those same hits of nostalgia, the cards we like to play with in the past, but juiced up to the present. And sometimes they land, sometimes they don't. But it's important to, recognize that you do get the opportunity to start with some other baseline, right? There's a lot of times where you'll see, oh, this is just like, I remember when Pack Rat came out, and Pack Rat was a huge, it was like, oh, this is just, card is so good, it's hard to beat, and limited. And then like for the next, must have been like 3 years or something, everyone was comparing a cheap black card that created a board presence on its own by way of like just using mana and discarding cards, like Crypt Breaker, for example, as like, this is the next Pack Rat, right? Like, this is the next blank card that had success. And while I think that it's valuable to talk about cards in a context that you already know, I think you really need to go a step beyond that, which is what I think that I sometimes am guilty of not doing. I know I definitely see, players who I know and who I talk about or talk about cards with, or see on social media, not necessarily take the full step further of like, okay, so why is this card the same and how is it different, right? We have a point on the board of a card that is similar to the card we're looking at, be it Nethergoyf as compared to Tarmogoyf, or be it one of a million things. You can pick.
I think Crypt Breaker Pack Rat's a great example. And for those who don't know, Pack Rat is like a rat that for every rat gets bigger, and for 2 and a black you can make a copy of Pack Rat and discard a card. And Crypt Breaker is it's a black for a 1/1 zombie that you can tap 3 zombies to draw a card, and for 2 and a black and discard a card, you make a 2/2 zombie. And I think that's
Yeah.
actually a great comparison. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, using a real world example of like, these two cards do similar ish things, right? I convert resources into bodies, and okay, how are these different? And I think, um, what you're mentioning about like delving into that of like how are they different though, because when you say something is like, hey, this is the next pack rat, I think really what you're helping people is, one, frame the card in the context, and two, impart a lot of learned lessons, right? And I do think that, like, and I'm guilty of this too, where it's like, okay, I should think more about like why this is different, and like, the nuance of it. And I think the funny part is haters often immediately go to that stuff, right? If you don't like the card, you point out like, well, pack rat was exponentially big, and every pack rat you made also had to make a pack rat text, blah 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 blah. But Crypt Breaker,
And you could do it immediately, so you didn't have to wait. Like, summoning sickness didn't matter, right? There's a
yeah,
lot of things that are different.
yeah, and in the same vein, I think also the Crypt Breaker is way different, right? Like, you get to draw cards from your zombies. Like, you could play Crypt Breaker from hand and tap some zombies on a board stall and generate more resources in a way that, like, Pack Rat, turned every resource into a Pack Rat, which was pretty good, and having a lot of power is good. But this was a different thing, which allows for different types of games, right? Pack Rat sort of creates these low resource games where you're all in on Pack Rat, and you just subsidize that with other cards like, Underworld Connections. But this card, sometimes lets you, play high resource games in your potentially aggro deck, which is where it saw its best home. And I think that, as I, sorry, hit the table there very loud for listeners. I think that's just something that, like, is really important to look at, is like, okay, when I say something is a Tarmogoyf, or is Pack Rat, or is, Fable the Mirror Breaker, like, Abe, if I tell you a card's a Fable the Mirror Breaker, what does that impart to you? Like, when I say that text to you, what are you thinking about?
I mean, a card being like Fable, right? That's got to be something that is a card that smooths out your game a bit, but also has the potential to kind of take over the game. A card that requires answers, but also, like, generates resources and advances you. I think that there's like, the same thing with, if I tell you that this card is a lot like, I think this happens a lot, as like Swords to Plowshare. So like, right, the single white removal spell is just like Path. It's just like, I think all cards and all types of cards are really subject to this. Or like, this is another Tarmogoyf. This is another Death Shadow. It's about, and I think it's really natural, right? We all think about things in the way of being the same as other things. And I mean, even down to like Counter Magic, we go, No More Lies is just Mana Leak, but No More Lies has been incredible. Mana Leak is an incredible card. Or like, Deduce is just the next Think Twice, but maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. But like, because it's analogous like that, it gives you the opportunity to then think about, how is it not analogous? Because that's going to get you closer to that truth.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, it's just, this is a great way when you're talking to somebody to maybe impart a lot of baseline. And then I think the real trick is like, I think, and let's say in the context of Deduce, I think this is like the new age Think Twice, which maybe doesn't sound super exciting, Abe, but I think in the context of Indomitable Creativity, my Think Twice, that like, is generating this material that's either another card or, my Arcana of Cruelty, that is really exciting to me, and that, maybe helps impart that knowledge to Abe, where it's the extra bit of context, right? Like, I'm thinking about this sort of thing. But if I message Abe, you see the new Think Twice eyeball emoji a bunch, he might not, jump there as well. But because I've like said new Think Twice, comma, thing that works well with it, I'm able to really get this idea. And you, even by yourself, maybe you don't have as many friends that you talk about cards with, or maybe I know I have some friends that don't even like to engage in preview season. They just sort of like, I'll play once the cards are out for a couple weeks. And maybe your friend group's like that. But you can still look at these things and try and, draw these comparisons. Or, importantly, you're listening to a Magic the Gathering podcast. I doubt we're the only one you listen to. If someone else says something on the podcast or a stream or an article you read, getting this, remembering that they're sort of trying to impart a lot of knowledge and probably not mean one-to-one is very important. You know, like Abe answered with my Fable the Mirror Breaker. If I tell Abe it's a Fable the Mirror Breaker card, it's probably a smoothing card that has a chance to run away with the game. You know, Seasoned Pyromancer is a lot like Fable the Mirror Breaker. Even though Seasoned Pyromancer came out first, it just wasn't the card that sort of, you know, had that pedigree and had that, you know, history behind it and the learning lessons. You know, speaking of cards that people didn't really talk about, Abe, Fable's a card that not many people really talked about during previous season. You know, there was some like, oh, this is cool, you know, I love Kiki Jiki, but there was not a lot of hype around Fable, you know, especially compared to how impactful that card's been to Magic. But anyways, I think Fable actually brings me to my next point, Abe, which I'll very quickly bring up and then we can delve into it, which is I look for cards that ask very little of me. That is a big thing that I'm wanting when I look at a card during a previews or thinking about adding to my deck. Basically, you know, if this thing doesn't have a huge opportunity cost, then I might be a lot more interested in it. And I think Fable's a great example of this, of, hey, you know, I kind of want you to play spells. You know, I want you to try and play normal Magic most of the time. And if you do that, I'll be a card that benefits you. That's a big thing that I look for during preview season.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that it's very in line with kind of what I was saying before about like thinking about the floors and the ceilings, right? Is that card with a really high floor asks very little of you because it's really good all of the times that you cast it, even if it's just on its own, right? It does not take a lot for that card to be worth the card that you invested in it compared to any other card it could have been. In the case of Fable the Mirror Breaker, right, like you're getting 2/2/2s that are good enough that they, you know, threaten to change the texture of the game if they're left unanswered. And they also give you, it also gives the opportunity to turn cards in your hand that are not good in that moment into new cards, right? Those are two things that are always good together and always good apart, and every effect on that card is good enough to be worth a card, and yet it only costs you one card to cast, and it's 3 mana. So that's a, you know, it does not ask much of you. It is very good at its floor on an empty board. You know, when you cast it, it's pretty good. If you're behind, it's making a blocker so that you can, you know, get to the part where you're looking for answers to maybe whatever you're behind to. And when you're ahead, it's just another problem for your opponent to solve that still lets you look for the cards that you're looking for, right? All of these scenarios say that, you know, it's not going to be very bad. And I think that, you know, that's really telling about a card. And I do think that most of the cards that you play in Constructed wind up meeting that marker, right? That's a really good marker because games of Magic are interactive and people will do things to your cards, and you won't always exist under, you know, the circumstances of when the card is the best, but that doesn't matter. When a card doesn't need a lot of other things to be going right for it to be good, then it's just going to be good, you know, most of the time, because oftentimes things aren't just going right for you. You know, when you play Magic. I don't know if you feel that way, Mason, but it doesn't feel like I get a cakewalk every game.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like it never happens. I feel like I'm getting unlucky all the time. I'm just like, I know I had a moment yesterday where I was playing a local Modern tournament and I added a bunch of kill spells to my Breach deck. I just added a lot of like spot removal, and I played against a friend round 1 who was playing Mono Red Prowess, and I didn't draw a kill spell across all 3 games, and I won, you know. But like near the end of the game, he was like chit chatting, like, I got pretty unlucky here, and I was like, dog, I got so unlucky, you know. And I was like ahead at that point, and I know I almost never say that stuff, you know, but I felt very comfortable with him being my friend and us sort of like being open. And he was like, you're about to win, like, how are you being unlucky? And I was like, dude, I have like 5 removal spells in my deck, and I drew none across 3 games and drew 20 cards each game. I don't know what you want from me. If that is unlucky. Now, is it like unlucky in a way that's like I can't overcome it? Clearly not. But it is unlucky. You know,
and thankfully your deck in playing Breach is right. Your cards are going to be fine, even if you don't draw that removal spell. It just helps you have time for those cards that are your best cards in your deck, right? Grinding Station, Underworld, Breach, and everything. Those removal spells give you time because you need to generate a condition where those cards are at their best instead of just being, you know, 2 mana do nothings.
No, definitely. And so I think that is very important. Like, fail rates just happen all the time. And, you gotta be able to sort of play through that.
Yeah, and I think it's perfect to segue into conversely, if the conditions that need to be created for a card, right? When this card is, you know, it doesn't ask a lot of you and can be really, right? Grinding Station and Underworld Breach. Those are cards that don't ask a lot of you when combined together, right? You just need to have Grinding Station, the Breach, a kill condition, right? And like Mox Amber or Mox Opal. Those are the whole conditions. Those cards just have to be in your deck. That's not a huge ask when the payoff is I win the game. Right?
Yeah.
Like if those are the conditions for my 2-mana artifact to say, actually I win the game now, like that is worth the times where even though it's a low floor, right? The card is just 2-mana artifact that says sack an artifact, mill someone for 3 cards. Like that's not very good. But when you have that engine go, it's really worth it, right? And to make that engine go, it doesn't ask a lot of you, so you can build a really functional deck around it. Is how we wind up with a deck like Temur Breach. And I think it's just important to remember that on both sides, like asking a lot of you doesn't necessarily mean your card has to have a high floor. The ceiling can be really high, and also compared to other things that say I win the game, like look at Splinter Twin, right? For me to win with Splinter Twin, which historically was one of the best combo decks I could be playing in that format, if not the best combo deck to be playing, because it did not ask much of you, right? I just had to cast Deceiver Exarch and then be able to resolve Splinter Twin on my Deceiver Exarch that could activate, right? If I did that, I won the game. In the same vein, this has the same asks of I need to resolve these 2 cards together, but it's less mana and maybe has more deck building requirements, as opposed to Twin, where it was like, okay, I'm playing kind of a blue-red control-y deck, and I have these, 7 or 10 slots dedicated to the combo.
Yep.
And I just think it's important to think about that when we're talking about, things that ask little of you, that it's not just things that are good alone, right? Things that work on their own. Not that isn't important on cards that they should work on their own, but not every card needs to be that way.
Yeah, right. Like, I think ask little, I think a lot of it's relative to what you get is maybe the better way to phrase this, right? Asks little and gives me a lot. And so, like, when talking about your Breach example, it asks more of me than, let's say, Flage or Ragavan, right? But what it gives me is better than what those cards give me, a percentage of the time, right? Obviously, every card we just talked about can win a game of Magic on its own somewhat easily, too, I think you could argue. But, like, my Breach Station, in comparison to my Flage Ragavan, this actually wins. And wins in spots that these other cards could never come close to winning. And sometimes in time frames that, these other cards never could. There's a screenshot going around Twitter about how this one person, turn 1 with Breach. And the reason it's going around is that's very hard to do. But it's totally reasonable to turn 2, turn 3 with a Breach. Well, if you're, playing, that's, like, if you think about the game in that context, that is such a powerful thing to do. Even though, I think we could both agree, if we were to ask which card's better in the vacuum, Ragavan or Grinding Station, we would probably say Ragavan, But when there's other context, other things go on, and, with the ability of these cards, the things they facilitate really, change the game in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if there are other things you really want to get into in terms of, like, I know there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to evaluating your card beyond just how it works in potential, right? The cards we're talking about right now in examples, I think talking a bit more about Grinding Station and Splinter Twin is pretty apt. Like, rate can matter a lot, right? Is a card going to do these things efficiently? Is a pretty big question, right? Compared to other things that could accomplish the same goals, does it do it at a better rate of mana exchange? Because ultimately, that's going to determine how often, if at all, you're going to get to do that. And so, I think that's like a really good baseline of, is this card competing with other cards trying to be in its lane and accomplish the same things this
Mm-hmm.
card accomplishes at a similar rate. But then also, and that's for like threats, but for answers, like, is this card going to like trade at a good rate, right? Like Fatal Push is very good because it always is going to trade for, something that costs 2 or less, maybe 4 or less. But even at 2 or less, you're trading even on your mana at your timing because it's an instant and creatures or sorceries, or better, right? You might get 2 mana for your 1 mana, or you might get 3 or 4 mana for your 1 mana at instant speed, and that generates a lot of disproportionate exchange in your favor in terms of mana compared to a card like Shoot the Sheriff, which can kill everything. Both cards are good, but it doesn't generate nearly the same kind of like mana exchange. Or even thinking like Hero's Downfall, right? The difference between Hero's Downfall and Fatal Push is that like Hero's Downfall is 3 times as expensive and can get stuck in your hand. Even Hero's Downfall and Shoot the Sheriff, right? Looking at these 3 removal spells, Hero's Downfall kills everything, but it costs so much mana so that you might, even though there might be planeswalkers you care about, you might wind up playing cards like Shoot the Sheriff or Long Goodbye to kind of answer the same problems because they're more efficient. And so, efficiency and comparative, strength to other cards that perform the same function is something that I think is really important to look at in that comparative vein. And also understanding the function of a card, right? We talk about like ceilings and floors, but not everything is as simple as that. Sometimes it's maybe this card has a really high ceiling in a world where it's surrounded by a certain context, where your deck is built a certain way. How can I create that, and is that good? Is that going to generate either more options or better outcomes in like certain sets of games? Does this card do a lot of things at maybe a higher rate, but because it covers a breadth of things, lets you care about other things less? I think about some charms are great examples of this, where at 2 or 3 mana, you're doing something that is worse than other things you could do at 2 or 3 mana. But because you get to do all of them, the card is more enticing, worth playing. I like thinking about those trade-offs. I think it's just one of the other most important things about evaluating cards, and something that I think people don't do enough of is thinking about what else could I do for my mana, right? What is the other card? In the meme, the girl who I'm looking at over my shoulder. What's she like? What does she do for the same amount of mana, right? It is important to think about.
No, I think that's really, really good to think about. And it really boils down to me of like opportunity cost of a card, right? Like when I put a card in my deck, I'm taking the spot of another card, right? Like I'm typically not going to go above 60 in a deck. It's very rare that it does happen. I've definitely done it and registered for tournaments that matter, so I don't want to say it's impossible. But like, I only have so many slots, right? And that means, when I play, like you said, let's say a Shoot the Sheriff or whatever, instead of a Fatal Push, well, maybe I have room for the Fatal Pushes, but also that means I'm cutting away from something else as well, right? It's a cascading thing. And I only have so much space in my deck to do the thing I want to do. So when I'm putting a card in my deck, I want to make sure that it's, sort of best in class for its spot, or if maybe not best in class, synergizes the best with my deck, right? Maybe I have a deck that involves, getting this 3 mana creature or this 5 mana creature down and killing it wins me the game. It says when I die, I win the game, basically, because of my combo. Well, that might be a reason for me to consider something like Shoot the Sheriff as a one of, right? Or to have that card in my deck. And that might be something that moves the needle, but it has to be like these really kind of, you need to have synergies instead of, rate in these sort of spots. So I think it's just important to remember that whenever you put a card in your deck, there is an opportunity cost of it because you're not putting another card in your deck. And this is a concept that I think people really struggle with because it sounds so obvious and so dumb in this moment. Like, I know how I sound right now saying there's the opportunity cost of a card, but I truly believe it to be a very real cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important to hit on. It's something that a lot of players, I think, know intuitively, but don't know everywhere that it applies, right? I think it's a like
Mm.
I remember this used to be the thing about Ornithopter is like, well, we print Ornithopter because sure it's zero, it's free, but like, is it really free? It costs you a card. You drew an Ornithopter instead of any other card it could have been, and sure it's a 0/2 flyer that costs you no mana, but is that free, right? Philosophically, is this a free thing? Um, Whereas like Elven Visionary, also free, right? It's replacing itself. It doesn't cost you a card, it just costs you mana. But like both these cards cost you a spot in their deck, right? That it did put something else into the deck that could have been something else. And when you're looking at, I mean, I think toolbox decks in Modern right now with like Green Sun Zenith. I think especially of like the Birthing Ritual combo deck, the Samwise deck. Like there's only so much room you have for cards that you can Green Suns for, even though you could get any green creature, and it's like, oh, it would be cool if I could get this one. It's like, well, if you're gonna say you can go get that one, you can't get another one, or you have to take something else out. And so, it really matters what that card could have been, and vice versa. If this card is there instead of the other card, am I okay with the trade-offs of that? And I think that those decisions, when you get down to like, the really fine details of it, which usually happens, we're kind of framing this as being during preview season, but even like in the first few weeks after a set comes out, or first few months after a large change to Modern, where so many cards are kind of back on the menu, you benefit by thinking about it in a more detailed context because you have a more detailed context, right? Right now we know what decks look like in a much more real sense than we did 2 months ago. So you can make a decision a little bit more informed about, is this card good or not, or is the trade-off of being able to have this card in my deck worth it compared to that card, or does this card that I'm seeing get previewed, does this cover all the same bases? Is this worth considering? Because what are the cards that I'm intending to surround it with, and what are the cards that I expect it to be interacting with, right? The more granular you can get, the better you're going to be like on the mark with how good a card is, or when you decide to play a card and try it out, how well it winds up performing, and does it accomplish what you want. And you're never going to be right all the time, but if you follow this kind of framework of thinking about it in these ways that we've been describing, I think you get pretty darn close.
Yeah, definitely. Abe, is there anything else you want to say before we wrap things up here?
No, I think that's everything I got.
Great. Well, hopefully that main topic was helpful for y'all. It is definitely a very interesting thing to think about. And Spencer's unfortunately not here this week. I wish we could have gotten his perspective on things as well. But that is one of the cool things, is I think you can learn something from sort of everybody, right? Everybody gets cards right. Everybody gets cards wrong. Like Wrenn 6 was a card that I put as a hit during the MH1 previews, Abe. During the companion previews, I put Yorion as the perfect companion. I was like, I wish they were all like this. This one's so fun and cool, and it's so unlikely to be a big player. I wish that all the companions are more like in this space. And obviously, I should say this. I got Wrenn 6 right for the wrong reasons. I had bad context with it, and then I got Yorion way wrong,
Yeah.
And like, it's just something that it's constantly, you can never stop learning with this sort of thing and being a student of the game. And I hope this was helpful for y'all. But now it is time for the always improving segment. If you haven't listened before, every week we like to take a little bit of time and talk about some way in which we've been improving in the last week when it comes to Magic Real Life in general. And Abe, I'm going to throw it to you first. What have you done this last week?
My always improving moment this week comes from a conversation I was having with a friend about. I was actually talking about the Table for Two podcast, because he'd been re-listening to it recently, and there was something that Haynes said on that podcast about like testing and preparing, and how like a lot of people will spend their time just kind of like tuning around the last few spots in a deck.
Mm-hmm.
And then like maybe change some things up, maybe not. And he said this is like not really the most effective way to do it, because you're not going to learn as much as you would if you were to just take an idea and stretch it to its maximum, right? Like, let's like put your stake in the ground and say, okay, I have this crazy idea of like, let's change everything about this and do things completely differently, and then see what you learn from that and see if it is successful or not. And then even if you wind up figuring out that that idea is not good, what did you learn from having that idea? And so I've been like, as a result of this, working on applying it in Modern. Like, one of the next things I'm going to be playing this week is going to be taking the kind of energy shell with Philia, and especially like the Overlord energy, like Mardu shell Philia, and reworking it to see what it looks like if it's black, if it's like red-black splashing white for Flage and for Philia, but like reworking it under the red and black interactive and threat packages, like playing more Bowmasters and like Ragamans and maybe DRCs and still Fables and Season Pyromancers and Flage is the top end, but not focusing so much on the like Ajani, Ocelot Pride stuff. And the reason for this is two parts. One is that I think there's potential there to have an edge against like the other energy players by playing a lot of these cards that are really strong in the mirrors and capturing a lot of the same upside draws of the like Overlord Mardu decks, with still having Philia and still having Flage. Like, those are two of the core things. But the other thing is that all of these cards that I'm listing are cards that are good in that mirror and should work. Like, the whole game plan should work similarly to how Energy's game plan works, like against many decks in the format of just playing efficient threats and letting them snowball to try to take over the game, and using your interaction to cleanly do that. But even if this idea doesn't pan out, and it turns out that the cards that I'm playing instead of like Ocelot Pride and Ajani are not good enough to make that worthwhile, I still should have a pretty good idea at the end of that, like playing 15 or so matches with it, of like which of these cards in my deck, especially if I play it when I'm playing against the mirror or against like the pseudo mirror of the energy decks or the Philia decks, what of these cards that I've put into my deck are the best ones to be playing to beat certain swaths of the metagame, right? Like, I get to try out a lot of the cards that are in in a couple copies, maybe 2 to 3 across the 75 in some of these Mardu and Boros lists, but get to try them in the context of like, okay, which one of these is the absolute best one for the types of games that I expect to play, when I know that Boros is going to be one of the most popular decks at the RC, and is one that I'm pretty heavily considering, like really between that and Breach. So that's what I've been doing this week, is really working on building that as my next priority. Once I'm done kind of working through the decks that are good and performing really well, like I've been playing some Eldrazi this week, but it's like one of my next things to do, especially as we're kind of honing in on crunch time here, to know what I want to do for a tournament that I think still has many unanswered questions, like I think Portland will.
Yeah.
How about you, Mason?
I really like that. I just want to say I really like the idea of stretching not only the limits, but spending some time to do that sort of stuff. I think that is how we so, lots of times it ends up you learn something and maybe you just move on, but it's also how like teams get to the big innovative decks. People are like, wow, I never would have thought to do X and Y, and it is doing what you're talking about there. So I wanted to give you big props for that.
Yeah, I think about what Sky shared on the show about like the vampires process a lot, and like if people in that room hadn't said, "What if we played vampires?" Like we none of that ever happens. Vein Ripper and Sorin are still cards just sitting on a shelf waiting to waiting to strike. So yeah, definitely. I mean, it can happen anytime. So
Yeah, definitely. So my always improving moment comes from something I've been playing a lot of League of Legends in my free time as a way to relax. I do Magic all day every day for work, and then I got to do a little bit more too to stay on top of stuff and for commentary reasons and podcasts, etc. So I really like being able to dive deep into something in the early learning phases, and something that I learned from Magic. And then, was kind of retaught watching some educational stuff on League of Legends that has reinvigorated me really thinking about this in Magic is the idea of like my actions create an action from my opponent, right? So in Magic, I think I talked to a lot of people about is like your opponent is doing the things for like a reason, right? And so when my opponent makes a play that looks weird, my first thought is what is something that makes logical sense for them to do that play, right? So a good example of this might be like the end of their turn, they're bolting their own Ragavan, right? Well, why might they do that? Well, maybe, like they have a Arena of Glory in hand and there's a Flage in hand and they're going to go like looting Arena, attack me, right? And maybe I have the way to play around that right now. I should consider something like that, right? Because that's such a absurd play. And obviously I came up with a very ham-fisted example, but there are lots of more real nuanced things like this that do occur. Your opponent makes a play that looks weird and they make an attack that looks weird. And I think about those things. And a thing that I used to know, I mean, and I should say this, I've always known, but was active in the front of my mind, was that when I do something, it really creates my opponent to respond to it, right? And in League of Legends, this happens via the, kind of the placement of my character on the map. And in Magic, I think this really occurs with the way I, like, cast my spells and sort of sequence my land drops and things like that, right? So if I hold up mana in my blue-white control deck on turn 5 or whatever, instead of playing, let's say Teferi here, Dominaria, that's going to really affect how my opponent plays the game, and I have a lot of ability to dictate sort of their play. It's like, hey, I know you really wanted to do X and Y, and you were hoping I slammed the Teferi this turn, but I'm not going to, like, me not doing this now maybe blanks that kill spell you had or your ability to alpha this, and instead I'm going to hold up and do, no more lives if you do something, and then my spot removal spell on your best threat and sort of work towards that. And that's just something that I have been relearning and sort of trying to put as an active thought in my mind. And I think one of the things that we do as Magic players so often is we learn something, we sort of put it in our mental shoebox in our closet and we move on, and I think it's really important to go back and rethink about these things that you've learned and think about them with the new context. I think it's probably a fair thing to say that when I learned that originally, that was years and years and years ago, and I'm a much better Magic player than I am now than I was then, right? And so revisiting this and thinking about it in the new context and with all the new knowledge I have can be very helpful. And I think there's lots of things like that for listeners. That you might be in the same boat as me, revisiting a topic or a thing you've already learned could be really helpful.
Sometimes, especially with some pretty like high level things like what you're talking about of like, making sure I'm recognizing how my actions prompt my opponent to think about what I'm doing and like how I might be able to use that information. Like that is a very, very high level way to think about the game. And if you're focusing on playing tight and to your like mechanics and technical play, right, like then I don't imagine that it's going to be very easy to also dedicate mental space to that. I think about our episode from last week on like, making, minimizing your mental strain for decisions and how that's beneficial, right? Like you can't do this and play really tight if one of those things isn't really second nature to you, right? It's very thought intensive. So it's definitely something that even if you learned it years ago, maybe at that time you were trying to apply it and your technical play suffered, but now you're in a better place where your technical play is more natural to you and that's something you can apply. Like it's going to be a more effective tool to put into practice now to increase, the returns on using it compared to where it might have been in the past, or even just a good thing to think about in your repertoire. So definitely always good to revisit those same ideas and think about them again and see, just kind of audit yourself on how am I putting this to practice, because I know it's something that's happening.
Definitely. That is going to do it for that part of the show. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. The show will always be free, but if you want to support the show in a more direct way, that is one way you can go about doing that. And by becoming a patron, you get to join our patron-only Discord, where there's a lot of talk. There's been a ton of standard talk recently, a good amount of modern. There's always stuff going on there. And another benefit is you get to ask the Patreon question on the show each week. And this week, Dexagos asked, what modern decks are you most excited about right now, especially after the unbanning? And this is, really after we got Portland in just 2 weeks from now, Abe. Charlotte a couple weeks after that. And we're doing a bonus episode this week as well for the show. If you're a patron, you get a mini bonus episode kind of about either the RC or the RCQ format and sort of what we would play. And this is a little sneak peek because we're going to be talking modern with the two RCs coming up. And Abe, I'm going to start with you first. What are you most excited about?
I'm really most excited about right now how the format has been changing. I think the black-white taxes deck is the most exciting thing that has happened to the format in a bit. Just seeing different ways that some cards that had not seen any play in a long time are getting revitalized by just people trying to maximize Overlord and Ophelia. And I played against, the first time I played against that deck and someone played Recruiter the Guard against me, I was shook. I was why? Who's playing this card? 3-mana 1/1 search is not what this format is about, but it clearly is if the deck works, right? So
yeah.
But I think that's really been moving the ball forward. I think in terms of what I'm most excited to play. I was just saying in my Always Improving segment, I think that for Portland especially, I'm trying to just stick to something I know will work, because there's not enough information out there really to me on what will really happen in that tournament, as far as the metagame, outside of what is kind of stock. And so I'm kind of trying to fall in line with that, either playing Boros or Mardu or Temur Breach, because I think those are some of those powerful decks. And as much as I think the Eldrazi deck is very strong, and I know it's had really, really strong challenge performances recently, I'm not sure that I feel comfortable enough with it or have really felt impressed with it when I've been playing it. But I'm trying to figure out why. If everyone's winning with the deck and I'm not, that's probably on me. So that's what I'm most excited about. How about you, Mason?
Yeah. By the way, you got to keep your eyes out. There's 2 RCs this weekend, Dave. So you're gonna get a little bit of data. We have Old Canada, and I think it's
and New Canada.
Yeah. Excuse me, New Canada. I think it's European, but now that I'm saying that out loud, it feels wrong. But there's 2 RCs this weekend, so keep an eye out for that. And if you're a listener, keep an eye out for coverage stuff. So when it comes to I agree that the black-white taxes or flicker or sewers, whatever you want to call it, that deck is really interesting. I think a big part of it really quickly is the Overlord plus Felia stuff of just, it gives you this grind, which the deck was always kind of good at, but that same interaction gives you some free wins. Going into turn 2 Felia, turn 3, maybe interact plus play an Overlord, draw a card, flicker my Overlord, draw another card, put a 5/5 into play. That's good enough to beat a lot of stuff. And in combination with the powerful sideboard cards that you get, it's a really interesting deck. So I'm really interested by that kind of stuff. I'm interested by all the different breach innovations. We've been seeing white pop up a lot more. We've been seeing 4 colors. We saw someone, I think, get 4th in a challenge playing black in their breach deck. I believe they were Grixis. They might have had a small splash for another sideboard card, but they were playing totally different stuff, like Fatal Push and Bossum from Assassin's Creed. And so there's a lot of definitely interesting stuff. And as for kind of what I'd be playing type thing, I'm commentating the RC in Portland, but I think I would be playing Breach if I had to play right now. Just to me, it seems so powerful. And while there are more and more hate coming its way as it's doing better and better, to me, it really, at least as of today, it's you got to prove it to me. And so far, I think, open deck lists, I can build a sideboard that can battle through a lot of it. I'm not going to overcome it easily, but open deck list, I think, really helps Breach, because I love to joke, Abe, that Breach is like one of the best decks in Modern, except it's weak to, Artifact, Graveyard, Enchantment, and Creature Hate. But besides that, it's one of the best decks. And in an open deck list environment, I can see literally the cards that might matter, where sometimes I play in closed deck list, and my opponent's brought in a card that I, personally think maybe isn't the best card, or maybe it was just the only option they had, right? They built their deck sort of in a way that was maybe not respecting Breach, hoping not to run into it, and they have, some card that's for a different matchup that overlaps, and I didn't play around it because it's like, yeah, I just didn't think about a race. That just wasn't on the menu for me, and you got me, So that is something that I'm really interested about, but I'm just really the most excited for Monday after Portland and looking over all the decks, because I am sure there'll be a lot of great innovation, even if maybe the top 8 looks a lot like what we know now. And honestly, with most RCs, it's never that way, right? People come out, they put the time in. I'm really excited to see sort of, what hard work and dedication is going to look like, and the results in the format afterwards. And then also a month later, we have that, let's see that churn that you talked so much about in the show of like, we don't have GPs anymore. We're not seeing that constant churn week after week. It only pops up during the RC season. And, it's a fun time of year. Anyways, that is going to do it for this week's episode. Dexos, thank you so much for that question. Once again, if you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/ccmtg. You can also check out untap.gg. They are a sponsor of the show. Our affiliate link for them is in the show description, and it is free to download, and it gives us a little bit of help if you want to do that. And they do have a premium service. You can check out all of that sort of stuff on their website. I know lots of people who use the free side of it and love it a lot. So maybe check it out and see if it's right for you. That is a thing for Magic Arena. If you have not heard of untap.gg before, that is my bad there, Untapped. Don't hate us for me forgetting to mention it early on in the pitch. If you want to find us, you can go to twitter.com, and you can also go to Blue Sky and search Constructed Criticism. You can also find us on YouTube under the same name. Abe, if someone wants to find you, where can they go?
You can find me over on Twitter and Blue Sky at More Nothings. I don't really post much on Twitter anymore, but Blue Sky is where most everything of mine happens. You can also send me a DM on there for coaching. I do have a few spots leading up to the RC. I probably have room for 1 or 2. Or you can send me an email over at morenothings@gmail.com. Just put coaching in the description. How about you, Mason?
You can find me on twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. You can find me on Blue Sky and Twitter under the name Mason E. Clark. You can reach out to me for coaching via that social media or my email, masoneclark@gmail.com. Put coaching in the description. That way I know you're not spam. And you can find me on coverage for the next few weeks. I am supposedly doing the Canadian RC this weekend, and then I'm doing the NRG next weekend, and then I'm doing the RC in Portland the weekend after that. So if you like Magic coverage, there is a lot going on, and I will be tweeting the links to all that when it happens. So you might want to follow me on social media or take a look over there if you're looking for those events. I don't have all those links in front of me right now, but it's going to be a very exciting time. I can't wait to talk a ton of Modern, and I can't wait to see you all next week for another episode of Constructed Criticism.
Magic, 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 magic.